Admiral John Grissom points his finger in her face and laughs. Sweetheart, this is an officer's function. I was invited, Jessica George says. By whom? The catering company? The room laughs with him. 300 people in white uniforms and diamonds, laughing at a woman in a lavender dress who hasn't moved an inch. Go on then, he says, wiping his eyes. Humor us. What's your rank? She doesn't blink. Higher than the one on your shoulder, Admiral. The laughter gets louder. He grins, shakes his head, and reaches out to pat her arm the way you'd pat a child who just said something cute and wrong. His fingers catch the edge of her sleeve. It slides 2 inches, and his hand freezes in the air. Have you ever watched a man's face fall apart in real time? Not from anger, from dread. Because in the next 10 minutes, this admiral, 3 weeks from his 5th star, is going to salute the woman he just called the help. And it still won't be enough to save him. To understand why, you have to go back 9 years. To a rooftop, to a sound only 2 people on this earth ever heard, and to a promise Jessica George made to a man who never came home to collect it. The garage smelled like motor oil and burnt coffee, the same way it had for 6 years. Jessica George kept the radio off. She liked the sound of metal on metal, the click of a socket wrench finding its groove, the low hum of the air compressor kicking on in the corner. It was the only quiet that made sense to her anymore. She was under a '68 Camaro when she heard the kid drop the torque wrench again. Rook. She didn't come out from under the car. Pick it up before it rolls under the lift. Sorry, Miss George. Don't apologize, just don't do it again. His name was Toby Marsh, 19 years old, hired 3 months ago because his uncle owed Jessica a favor, and Toby needed the work. He was lanky in a way that hadn't caught up with his hands yet, always fumbling something, always talking when he should have been listening. He reminded her of a checklist she hadn't run through in 9 years, the kind you run at 3 a.m. before a job. Twice. Because a shaking hand cost more than a slow one. She rolled out from under the Camaro and wiped her palms on a rag that used to be a Navy PT shirt, gray now, the lettering long gone. Toby was holding a torque wrench like it was a snake that might turn on him. You're gripping it too hard, she said. Loosen your hand. It's not going to run away from you. You always say that, because you always do it. He grinned at her, and something about the grin quick, a little nervous, eager to please made her chest tighten in a way she didn't have a name for. She turned back to the Camaro, so he wouldn't see her face do whatever it was doing. Her phone buzzed on the workbench. She glanced at it, a text from her sister, something about Sunday dinner, and set it face down without answering. She'd gotten good at that, letting things sit face down. Toby was still watching her. You ever gonna teach me the exhaust system, or am I just gonna hand you tools for the rest of my natural life? Depends if you can hold one without dropping it. That was one time. That was Tuesday. It's Thursday. He laughed, and it was an honest laugh, and she almost smiled, and then she caught herself and didn't. She had a rule about that. Smiling too easy made people ask questions, and questions were doors, and she'd spent 9 years keeping every door in her life shut except the ones that led back out to the street. The Camaro belonged to a retired dentist named Foster, who'd bought it as a divorce present to himself. He came by around noon in a golf shirt, asked if it was ready, and Jessica told him Friday. Not a day sooner. He didn't argue. Nobody argued with her about timelines. She'd built the shop's reputation on being right about how long things actually took, which was rarer in this business than people expected, and rarer still in a town where most of the mechanics were men who'd tell you Tuesday and mean sometime next month. She ran the shop alone except for Toby, and she liked it that way. No small talk about weekends. No one asking why a woman with hands as steady as hers had ended up fixing carburetors in a town 2 hours from the nearest naval base. No one noticing that she flinched, just slightly, whenever a car backfired on Route 9. Around 2, Toby was under the hood of a Ford pickup trying to trace a wiring short, muttering to himself the way he did when he was concentrating. And he said, without looking up, "My brother's thinking about enlisting." Jessica's hands went still over the parts tray. "Yeah?" she said, careful even. "Which branch?" "Navy, probably. He wants to do the SEAL thing. Says he's been training for it since sophomore year, running with a weighted vest and everything." Toby laughed a little. "I told him he's going to quit in a week." "Don't tell him that." Something in her voice made him look up. "I'm serious," she said. "Don't tell him that. Tell him it's hard. Tell him most people quit and it's not a shameful thing to quit. but don't tell him he's going to fail before he starts. That kind of thing gets in a person's head. It sits there. Toby blinked at her. Okay. Damn. I didn't mean anything by it. I know. She picked the wrench back up. Just hand me the 3/8. He handed it to her, and their fingers almost touched, and she pulled her hand back a half second too fast, like his skin might carry something. That was the thing about Toby. It wasn't his face. It wasn't even really his laugh. It was the way he held tools like he was scared of breaking them. The exact way a boy from Ohio once held a spotting scope like it was made of glass, a boy who'd talked too much and apologized too easily and had a habit of dropping things when he was nervous, right up until the moment it mattered, when his hands went perfectly, unnaturally still. She didn't let herself finish that thought. She never did. She'd built an entire life on the muscle of not finishing that thought. The same discipline that used to keep a rifle steady in freezing wind now kept her whole face steady in front of a 19-year-old kid who had no idea what he'd just walked past. At 6, Toby clocked out, said "Night, Miss George," the way he always did, and jogged to his beat-up Corolla, backpack slung over one shoulder. Jessica watched him pull out of the lot, watched his taillights disappear down Route 9, and only then let her shoulders drop. She locked the garage, and on her way to her truck, she stopped at the mailbox out front, the one she almost never checked because bills came electronic now, and nobody handwrote her anything anymore. There was one envelope inside, government return address, heavy cream-colored paper, the kind that cost someone a specific line item in a specific budget. She stood in the gravel lot with the sun going down behind the shop, and she didn't open it right away. She just held it, the way you hold something you already know is going to change the shape of your week, maybe the shape of your whole careful, quiet life. If you've ever built a life around not being seen around, answering the phone late, or turning the radio off so the silence stays yours, you already know what she was feeling standing there. And if that's you, watching this right now, I want you to know something before we go any further. The people who go quiet aren't always at peace. Sometimes they're just tired of explaining. Drop a comment if you've ever done that, gone quiet instead of grieving out loud, because Jessica's about to learn that the past doesn't stay filed away just because you stop talking about it. The envelope sat on her passenger seat the whole drive home, and she didn't touch it again until she was sitting in her kitchen with the porch light off and a glass of water she didn't drink. She turned it over twice. Then she set it down flat on the table, the way you'd set down something that might go off if you tilted it wrong, and she closed her eyes, and the kitchen disappeared, and she was back on the roof, 9 years ago. A city whose name never made it into any newspaper because the mission never officially existed. 3 in the morning, the kind of heat that doesn't cool off after dark, just sits on your skin like a wet towel. She was 26 then, already the one the younger guys watched to see how scared they were allowed to be. Elias was beside her, 19, a private who'd lied about his age to get in 2 years early, and nobody had ever bothered to check because he could run a radio faster than anyone in the unit. He talked too much. That was the thing people forgot to tell you about him afterward. When he became a name on a wall instead of a person, he talked constantly, nervous chatter, filling silence like it scared him more than gunfire did. He'd tell her about his mother's diner back home, the smell of the fryer, how she made him promise to come back and finally learn to flip the eggs without breaking the yolk. He dropped things when he was nervous. He'd fumbled the radio twice that night already, and she'd told him, low and even, hands steady, just breathe. You don't have to be fast. You have to be right. The mission wasn't the clean, quiet thing people imagine when they hear the word rooftop. It was static in her earpiece, cutting in and out, because the relay tower 2 blocks over had taken damage nobody accounted for. It was a floor plan that didn't match what was actually inside the building. A door that should have been unlocked and wasn't. 4 extra minutes lost forcing it that put the whole timeline behind. It was her team lead's voice breaking up mid-sentence right when it mattered most, so that the last 3 words of an order got swallowed by dead air, and she had to guess what they were. She guessed wrong. Or she guessed right, and it didn't matter, because guessing at all was the crime, in the version of it she'd told herself every night since. There was a window of maybe 2 seconds where a man on the floor below them, someone who wasn't supposed to be there, someone whose exact role in the whole thing she still didn't fully understand 9 years later, stepped into a sightline he shouldn't have had. Elias saw him first. Elias, 19, radio in one hand, said something into the static that she didn't catch clean. 3 words, maybe 4, cut by the tower dropping out again, and she had less than a second to decide whether what she'd heard meant hold or meant go. She said go. She still doesn't know. Not for certain. Not the way you know your own name, whether that was the order that came down or the order she filled in herself, because a body needs something to move on. That's the part nobody in 9 years has let her say out loud. Not once. Because the official report doesn't have room for a sentence like "I'm not sure I heard him right." The official report has clean lines and clean outcomes. A mission success, 5 extracted alive, 1 killed in action, shielding his teammate during an unexpected engagement. That last part was true. He did shield her. He physically moved his body between her and the sightline in the same half-second she gave the order, which meant the order and the shield happened at almost the same instant, which meant she has spent 9 years unable to separate whether she saved 4 other people that night or whether she killed the 5th one with her own mouth. He didn't die instantly. That was the part the file didn't say either. He lived long enough for her to get her hand flat against the wound and to hear him say, not scared, almost apologetic, like he'd broken another wrench. Sorry, I dropped the, and then nothing else came out, because there wasn't time for anything else to come out. She held him until the extraction team reached the roof, and by then his mother's diner and the eggs, and the promise he never got to keep, were already sitting somewhere she'd have to carry them for the rest of her life, whether she wanted to or not. She opened her eyes in her own kitchen 9 years later, and the porch light was still off, and the water glass had gone warm on the table, and Toby's laugh from that afternoon was still sitting somewhere behind her sternum, because it was the same laugh. Not close to the same rhythm, the same nervous lift at the end of a sentence, the same habit of apologizing for things that weren't his fault. She had hired a boy who reminded her of a dead 19-year-old and told herself for 3 months it was a coincidence. The way you tell yourself a lot of things to keep a garage running and a mortgage paid and a face steady in front of customers who just want their transmission fixed by Friday. She finally opened the envelope. The letterhead was from the Naval Inspector General's office, and the language was careful in the particular way government language is careful when it's trying not to say the word investigation directly. The file on the operation 9 years ago had been reopened, the letter said, in connection with a broader review of after-action reporting from that period. Her presence was requested, not ordered, at a preliminary inquiry, voluntary. For now. She read it twice, and neither time did the sentence about Elias, about how his family had never been given the full account, about how the credit for that extraction had been folded quietly into a much larger operation with a much more photogenic name attached to it. Surprise her. She'd always known, somewhere under the part of her brain that ran torque specs and oil change intervals, that somebody else's name was sitting on top of that night. She just hadn't known, until this letter, that anyone in Washington had finally noticed too. She thought about Elias's mother, still running that diner as far as she knew, still not knowing the whole shape of the last 90 seconds of her son's life. And she thought, sitting there with the water gone warm and the porch dark, that maybe the reason she'd never let herself finish grieving him properly wasn't peace at all. It was guilt wearing peace's clothes. If you've ever done that yourself, held on to a version of quiet that was really just avoidance, you already know how heavy it gets. Stay with me, because in 3 weeks, that same silence walks into a ballroom in a lavender dress, and it is about to get a lot louder whether Jessica is ready or not. She didn't sleep much that night. She sat at the kitchen table until almost 2 in the morning with the letter under her palm, and somewhere around midnight she picked up her phone and typed a reply to the Inspector General's office and deleted it 4 times before she finally just turned the phone face down again, same as she'd done with her sister's text. The thing nobody tells you about being asked to testify is that saying yes means opening a door you spent 9 years bricking shut with your own hands. She'd built a whole structure on top of that door: the garage, the quiet town, Toby dropping wrenches, Foster's Camaro, the version of her life where nobody asked why a woman with her particular calm, under pressure, ended up doing brake jobs 2 hours from the nearest naval installation. Testifying meant somebody official, somebody with a recorder and a legal pad, was going to ask her to describe the exact 90 seconds she'd never described to anyone. Not a counselor, not her sister, not the one man she'd almost married 4 years ago who left. In the end, because he said he couldn't build a life with someone who wouldn't tell him where she went at night in her own head. She called the number on the letterhead the next morning from the garage office, phone wedged against her shoulder while she filled out a parts order for a water pump. The woman on the line was polite in the practiced way government employees are polite when they've made this exact call 100 times. "I'd like to decline," Jessica said. "You're allowed to decline the preliminary inquiry. I should tell you, though, it's likely to be reopened as a formal proceeding regardless, given the nature of the discrepancy. Your testimony now is voluntary. Later, it may not be." "What discrepancy?" There was a pause, the kind where someone on the other end is deciding how much of a legal document they're allowed to summarize out loud. "The unit citation from that operation," the woman said carefully, "was issued under a different chain of command than the one present for the extraction phase. That's really all I can say on an open line." Jessica hung up without saying goodbye, which wasn't like her, and stood there with the water pump order half filled out, staring at a torque spec she'd written 1,000 times and could not, for a second, remember how to read. Toby knocked on the office doorframe around 11. "Miss George? Foster's here early for the Camaro. Tell him it's not ready. He says he's got somewhere to be tonight. Some Navy thing. Says half the base is invited, retired officers, the whole deal, and he wants to drive it there." She looked up. "What Navy thing?" Toby shrugged, checking something on his phone before answering. "The way 19-year-olds do now. Like the truth lives in a screen and not in his own memory. Some memorial gala. Says it's for a guy who died on some classified op years back. They finally got clearance to do a proper ceremony for him. Foster's all excited. Keeps saying half these admirals owe him rounds of golf." The water pump order slid a little in her hand. "What's the man's name?" she said, and her voice came out flatter than she meant it to. Toby scrolled. Hang on. Elias something. Foster wrote it on the invite. It's in the truck." She didn't answer him. She set the clipboard down on the desk very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid your hand might otherwise throw, and she walked out to the bay and told Foster his Camaro would be ready by 6 if he could wait that long. And he said, "Of course, take your time," and clapped her on the shoulder like they were old friends, and she stood there afterward with his hand-shaped warmth still on her shoulder, and felt something crack open that she'd spent 9 years gluing shut every single morning. She almost didn't go home to change. She almost called Foster back and told him the car had a problem. A real one, something with a transmission that would take another week, anything to buy herself a reason not to stand in a room where Elias's name might finally be spoken by someone who wasn't her. But she thought about his mother, still flipping eggs in that diner, still not knowing the shape of the last 90 seconds, and she thought that if there was a room somewhere tonight where his name was finally going to be said out loud in public for the first time in 9 years, she was not going to be the coward who stayed home and let it happen without her. She had one good dress, lavender, bought 3 years ago for her sister's wedding and never worn since, still in the dry cleaner's plastic in the back of her closet. She put it on standing in front of a mirror that needed resilvering in the corner, and she looked at herself for a long time, and she thought about how strange it was that the body that held a rifle steady for 11 hours in freezing wind could look, in a dress, in a small bathroom mirror, like nothing at all had ever happened to it. She drove her truck, not an SUV, not anything that said money, just a 10-year-old Tacoma with 200,000 miles on it, the 90 minutes to the naval base where the gala was being held, and the whole way there she made herself one promise. The same promise she'd made in the kitchen the night before with the letter under her hand. She was not going to speak. She was going to stand near the back, hear his name said once, and leave before anyone asked her a single question about who she used to be. She did not know. Pulling into that parking lot full of Mercedes sedans and one absurd stretch limousine some captain had clearly rented to impress somebody, that the promise was already broken the second she stepped out of the truck in that lavender dress. Because a 4-star Admiral 3 weeks from his 5th star was standing just inside those doors, holding a glass of champagne, about to decide, the way powerful men decide these things without ever really deciding them, that the woman walking in alone did not belong in his room. If you've ever gone somewhere with your whole plan already decided, only to have one person's cruelty rip that plan out of your hands before you even got your coat off, stay with me. Because what happens next in that ballroom is the reason we're all here tonight. And Jessica George had no idea, walking through those doors, that she was about to say a dead man's name out loud for the first time in 9 years. Not to a counselor, not in private, but in front of 300 people who were laughing at her. She'd made it maybe 10 feet past the doors before Admiral Grissom noticed her. He was holding court near the champagne table, silver-haired, 4 stars catching the chandelier light, the kind of laugh that filled a room because he expected it to. She recognized the type before she recognized the man. She'd spent a career around men like that, men who mistook a quiet room for an empty one. She kept her eyes forward, looking for a wall to stand against, a corner where she could hear a name read aloud and then leave. She didn't get the corner. "Well now," Grissom said, loud enough that 6 or 7 people turned. "Sweetheart, this is an officer's function." She stopped. She had told herself in the truck she wasn't going to speak to anyone. That promise lasted exactly as long as it took him to plant himself in front of her, blocking the path to the wall she'd already picked out. "I was invited," she said. "By whom? The catering company?" The laugh that went up around him wasn't even cruel exactly. That was the worst part. It was easy. The kind of laugh people give a joke they've heard a version of 100 times and never get tired of. A woman near him in a beaded gown pressed a hand to her mouth, delighted. Someone's champagne glass clinked against another. Jessica felt her jaw tighten, the same tightness she used to feel lying on a rooftop with wind moving the wrong direction across a scope. 9 years of practice kept her face from showing it. "Go on then," Grissom said, wiping at his eye like the effort of laughing had actually cost him something. "Humor us. What's your rank?" "Higher than the one on your shoulder, Admiral." The laughter cracked louder, and somewhere behind him a captain actually clapped once, delighted at his own admiral's wit, and Grissom grinned wide and reached out to pat her arm, the way you'd pat a child who'd said something charming and wrong. His fingers caught the edge of her sleeve. It slid 2 inches up her forearm. His hand stopped moving. Nobody else in the group seemed to notice yet, still riding the wave of the joke, but Grissom's eyes had gone to her wrist and stayed there, and his face did something that had nothing to do with the champagne or the laughter around him. It went the color of the tablecloths. His mouth opened, and no sound came out of it for a second, maybe 2, which doesn't sound like long until you've watched it happen to a man who has never once in his adult life been at a loss for words in public. A captain standing at his elbow, younger, sharper, the kind of officer who notices everything because his career depends on it, followed the Admiral's stare down to her arm and frowned. "Sir, everything all." "That mark," Grissom said. His voice had lost every ounce of the performance it carried 30 seconds earlier. "Where did you get that mark?" Jessica didn't pull her sleeve back down. She let it stay where his hand had pushed it, the small black ink resting plain under the chandelier light, a shape most people in that room would never recognize even looking straight at it. But he recognized it. She could see it land in him like something physical. "You know exactly where I got it," she said quietly. The younger captain leaned in, squinting at her arm like it might be a trick of the light or a costume shop tattoo some gala guest had thought was clever. "Sir, with respect, half the base has ink like that. Could be anything. Coincidence." "It's not a coincidence," Grissom said, but it came out thin, like he was arguing with himself as much as with the captain. "It could be, sir. You'd need—" "I need her to say the name," Grissom said. And for the first time that night, his voice wasn't performing for anyone. It was just a man, gray at the temples, asking a question he was afraid of the answer to. "Say the name." The room had gone quieter around them, without Jessica noticing exactly when. A few more faces had turned. Someone's phone came up, recording out of habit before understanding what it was recording. 9 years she had not said it out loud to another living person. Not to her sister, not to the man who'd left her 4 years ago for the exact silence she was standing inside of right now. Not to a counselor at the VA clinic 2 hours from her garage, whose office had a crack running down the corner of the ceiling that she used to stare at instead of talking. She had said it to herself, alone, in a truck, in a kitchen with the porch light off, but never once out loud where someone else could hear it and make it real. Her mouth went dry the way it used to go dry before a shot she couldn't afford to miss. "Elias," she said. The word came out steady on the first syllable and cracked slightly on the second. The way a plank cracks under weight it was built to hold but never actually tested against. She said the last name too. Clear, deliberate, the way you read a name off a wall you've never let yourself visit. The younger captain's face changed first, the doubt draining out of it fast, because the name matched something in a file he'd clearly seen and never expected to hear spoken by a stranger in a lavender dress at a party. Grissom's champagne glass had gone still in his hand, forgotten. He talked about eggs, Jessica said, and she didn't know why that detail came out of her instead of anything else, except that it was the truest thing she had. His mother's diner. He wanted to learn to flip them without breaking the yolk. He was going to go home and finally learn that. Her voice held. Barely. He didn't get to. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, a young enlisted woman, maybe the same age Jessica had been on that rooftop, put a hand over her own mouth, eyes wet, without fully understanding yet what she was crying about. Grissom set his champagne glass down on the nearest table, with a hand that wasn't entirely steady, and for the first time since Jessica had walked through those doors, the room wasn't laughing at all. If you've ever had to say a name out loud that you'd buried for years, just to make someone finally believe you, you already know what that costs a person. It doesn't heal anything right away. It just cracks the door open. And what walked through that door next is the part nobody in that ballroom saw coming, including the Admiral standing 3 weeks from his 5th star, whose hand was about to rise into a salute he never imagined giving to the woman he'd called catering 10 minutes earlier. Grissom's salute, when it finally came, was slow and shaking, and nobody in that ballroom clapped. There wasn't anything to clap for. A 4-star admiral standing at attention in front of a woman he'd mocked 90 seconds earlier isn't a victory. It's just the truth arriving late, the way it usually does. Jessica didn't stay for the rest of the party. She gave her statement to the younger captain, the one who doubted the tattoo, and by the time she got back to her Tacoma in the parking lot full of Mercedes sedans, her phone already had 4 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize and 1 text from her sister asking if she was okay, which meant word had already started moving before Jessica had even left the building. The Inspector General's inquiry, once it reopened for real, took 11 weeks. She testified twice, once by phone and once in person, in a windowless room with fluorescent lighting and a water pitcher nobody touched. She told them about the static, the drop tower signal, the 4 minutes lost at the door, the order she still isn't fully certain she heard right. She told them the truth exactly the way she'd never let herself tell it before, without smoothing the edges, without making herself the clean hero of it. Some days she wasn't sure that was what they wanted to hear. She said it anyway. The findings came back in a letter almost as heavy and cream-colored as the first one. Grissom's name had indeed been on the original after-action report 9 years ago, the one that folded Jessica's unit's extraction into a larger, more visible operation, carrying his command's name instead of hers. The review called it a reporting irregularity. It didn't call it what it was. His nomination for a 5th star was quietly withdrawn the same week the footage from the gala had already made its way across every corner of the internet, 2 separate scandals arriving at once and finishing each other off. But his pension stayed untouched. His retirement, when it came a month later, was described in a press release as a personal decision after a distinguished career. Nobody used the word forced. Nobody had to. Jessica read that release standing in her kitchen with a cup of coffee gone cold, and she felt something that surprised her, not triumph, not even relief exactly, just a tired kind of recognition. The institution had protected a piece of itself, the way institutions always do, and the man who'd called her catering in front of 300 people still got to keep his house and his retirement checks. In some rooms, probably still got introduced as Admiral. She wasn't naive enough to think a viral video fixes something built over decades. If you've ever waited years for an apology and gotten a press release instead, you already know exactly the shape of what she was feeling standing in that kitchen. But there was one thing the review confirmed in writing. In language, a lawyer somewhere had clearly fought to keep plain and undeniable. Elias's family had never been told the full account of his death, and the unit's actual role in that extraction had never been properly credited. That sentence, more than the salute, more than the video, more than any of it, was the one Jessica read 4 times standing at her counter. Toby noticed something different about her the week she came back to the garage. She still corrected him about gripping the torque wrench too hard. She still told him not to apologize, just not to do it again. But one afternoon, watching him fumble a socket for the 2nd time in an hour, she didn't snap at all. She just took it from his hand, showed him the angle, and said, quiet almost to herself, "You remind me of somebody I used to know. Somebody good. I never told you that because it wasn't fair to you." Toby didn't fully understand what she meant, and she didn't explain further, But something eased between them that day that had been sitting there, unnamed, for 3 months. She drove out to see Elias's mother on a Saturday, 4 hours each way, a diner on a corner she recognized from a photograph she'd seen once 9 years ago and never forgotten. The woman behind the counter was older now, silver coming into her hair, a Rolex on her wrist that Jessica guessed had belonged to Elias's father, worn every day probably since he passed, the way people wear a small piece of someone to keep them close. Jessica sat in a booth by the window and ordered coffee she didn't drink. And when the woman finally sat down across from her, Jessica told her everything. Not the file version. Not the version with clean lines and a heroic sacrifice. The real one, the static, the 4 lost minutes. The order she still isn't sure she heard right. The 2 seconds where he saw the danger before she did and moved his body into it anyway. Elias's mother listened without interrupting, hands wrapped around her own coffee cup. And when Jessica got to the part about the eggs, about how he wanted to come home and finally learn to flip them without breaking the yolk, the woman's face broke open in a way that had nothing performed about it, nothing for cameras, just a mother hearing her son's voice again secondhand after 9 years of silence. Jessica reached into her bag and took out the things she'd carried the whole 4-hour drive, wrapped in a soft cloth, not a coin, nothing anyone had struck for the occasion, just Elias's old radio call sign patch, the one she'd quietly kept off the gear inventory the night he died, because she couldn't stand the thought of it going into a box in a warehouse somewhere. She'd carried it in a drawer for 9 years. She set it on the table and slid it across. "He talked about you every single night up there," Jessica said. "Every single one. He wanted you to know he made it further than he thought he would. He wanted you to know he wasn't scared. Not really, not at the end." He was thinking about the diner. Elias's mother closed her hand around the patch and didn't say anything for a long time, and neither did Jessica. And the diner around them kept running the way diners do. Someone flipping eggs at the grill, the bell over the door ringing for a new customer, ordinary life continuing exactly the way it had continued for Jessica every single day for 9 years while she carried this alone. That was the ending nobody filmed. No applause, no reverse salute, no 4-star Admiral standing frozen in front of 300 witnesses. Just 2 women in a diner booth, a patch changing hands, and a promise 9 years overdue finally kept in the quietest way possible. If this story reached something in you, if you've ever carried a name you were too afraid to say out loud, or held onto quiet when what you really needed was to be heard, don't scroll past this without telling someone about it tonight. Share it with the person who needs to hear that the ones who go quiet are usually the ones who gave the most. And remember what Jessica learned the hard way. Rank tells you where somebody stands in a room. It never tells you what they survived to get there.